Hello everybody, this is my name is Bill Boley. I work for the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, Cost and Economics Analysis Division, FCC. This is a training I put together on learning curves as a on-the-job training classroom session in order to help people gain an understanding of learning curves and how to apply them before they actually put it into their work. Here's the content of the briefing. We're going to go over some definitions, the concepts, the formulas, where to get data in order to do the calculations. There's an application portion of this as well where we'll jump over to Excel to do that, and then we'll come back to the slides for the summary. And again, the objective of this on-the-job training is to calculate a learning curve and cross-check the data to validate that the demonstrated rate is reasonable. So again, that's the objective. So what is a learning curve? A learning curve is is used when there's a repetitive task. The concept is that that repetitive task will become more efficient over time. Think of it as something as simple as tying your shoes. The first time you tied your shoes, it probably took you a long time. The second time you tied your shoes, still took you a long time. But now you've tied your shoes a couple 100,000 times and you tie your shoes in no time. The same goes for anything when you're building something, when you're bending metal, when you got hands-on labor. As long as all the things that you're doing are homogeneous, meaning you're doing the same thing over and over again. As long as the manufacturer makes all the units, obviously it doesn't. You wouldn't use a learning curve in cost estimating if you're using multiple contractors or you're producing things in different sectors or different types of things. Again, we also want to make sure the production of those things is continuous. If there is a break in the production, so in government contracts, if you had separate lots for CLINs for the contract, you may have a break between the award of each CLIN, so the manufacturer may have to shut down the production line. That's not something that can't be accounted for. It's just not typical learning. You're going to have to do something above and beyond just normal learning in order to account for that production break. And again, production learning curves can be calculated in hours or dollars. Hours are easy enough to dollarize once you have the hours, so we can do the calculations work in both. So there's two basic theories to learning curve. There's the unit learning curve theory, and then there's a cumulative average learning curve theory. The unit learning curve theory basically says that as the quantity of the units produced doubles, the cost to produce a unit is decreased by a constant percentage. So you see in the example here, we've got a 95% learning curve. The first unit cost 1,000. Be that 1,000 hours or $1,000, it doesn't matter. As you see, when we go from 1 to 2, which is a doubling of the units, we've got a reduction by 5%. So the unit 2 costs 95% of unit 1. Similarly, you see unit 4 costs 95% of unit 2, and unit 8 costs 95% of unit 4. So as the quantity doubles, the price skips down by that constant percentage. In cumulative average learning curve, as the quantity of units produced doubles, the average cost of all units produced to date is decreased by a constant percentage. So this is an important distinction in this theory here, where we're talking about the average cost of all units produced. So at after the first unit, again, we're the same scenario. We've got a 95% learning curve. We've got the first unit costs 1,000. After the second unit's produced, the average cost of the first 2 units is $950. And then again, after the fourth unit is produced, the average cost of the first 4 units is 902.5. And again, at 8, the average cost of all 8 units. So again, to dig in a little deeper into this learning curve, you don't need to. You can apply learning curves at various levels of a work breakdown structure. So if you have some systems or subassemblies that are all being assembled together, you could apply learning curves at the subassembly level or the subsystem level. The learning curves for those different subsystems could be different as well. Some systems, obviously, learning is faster, and your experience base of your employees may be different for different subsystems, so you may expect more or less learning. So there's factors that can affect the learning for any particular thing. You could have a part of the system that is not expected to have any learning at all because it's just a part you buy from a third party, and it just comes in at that price and there's no learning. Some subsystems are like that. So in this example, you see there's all these subsystems. They all have their own learning curves. They all have their own T1, or the theoretical first unit cost. So that's the first unit's cost or hours to produce. And then they have learning curves out here. With this table, we can ask ourselves, okay, well, if we're going to buy 32 units, what's the price of that 32nd unit? Or how many hours do we plan for if we're planning for building that 32nd unit? And this method, we can answer that question because we know what that unit's going to cost based on the fact that we know what the learning curves are, and we know what it costs for the 16th unit, and so when it doubles, we know it's going to decrease by that specific amount. However, when we go to the cumulative average learning curve, same scenario, same numbers, except this is now the average of the costs, and we ask ourselves the same question. We can't answer this question now, because if we want to know what to plan for the 32nd unit, the actual calculations here don't give us that answer. They give us the average of all 32 units, not the specific needs for the 32nd unit. So we can't answer the specifics of a unit. And again, this is why we lean towards the unit theory when we're doing budgeting and cost estimating, because it gives us more specific values that we can tie to specific units, so that when we're planning on when we're going to execute these things, we know how much to plan when. Whereas cumulative average is not going to give us that. We're going to have to figure that out in some other form in order to budget properly for what we're buying when we're buying it. So now we're going to get into some formulas. You'll obviously have this as a reference, so you don't have to memorize all the formulas, but the concept formulas are pretty simple. So if you happen to have the cost of the Unit 1 and the cost of Unit 2, or the hours for Unit 1 and Unit 2, or any pairing that's a doubling, so Units 4 and 8 or 8 and 16 or so on, you can pretty simply calculate the learning curve. You can just divide the cost of the later unit by the cost of the earlier unit, and it'll give you that ratio, which is your learning curve slope. And there you have it. You know what your learning curve is. From there, you can calculate the slope into this other format in order to use it in some of the equations. So in this example here, the learning curve ended up being 86.4%. In order to calculate the variable b in the learning curve slope calculation here, we would then take the natural log ln of 0.864 and divide that by the natural log of 2, and it gives us this the variable here, negative 0.211. This is how we calculate that slope. This is how we get that curve that you see in the picture. And then from there, you can convert it back to the percentage by raising 2 to the power of negative 0.211. Of course, most of the time we're not going to have data like this. I mean, this is the ideal scenario where we have the pairing of an n to n, or a doubling of the units data available, so we can say number 4 and 8 or whatever, they cost this much, and we can compare those two. It's not very common for us to actually have access to data like that. More commonly, we're going to have data about, okay, well, we produced 10 units and it cost this much for all 10. That doesn't really give us enough information to do that kind of calculation. So we're going to go into, well, what do we do in that scenario? So when we have the lot data, we can plot the lot data and we can look at the distance between them, and we can see how this compares. So again, this is the lot data based on the prior information, the prior slide, same learning curve as the prior slide. And you'll see when we plot the lot data, it's a straight line because we only have 2 data points, and we're not on the same line, and we're not on the same plane as far as what that learning curve looks like. But if we convert both sets of data to log space as opposed to real space, which is just a mathematical conversion of the data, we see that both the lot data and the perfect data, if you will, or the data that's in the pairs of the doubling pairs, are on the same plane now, and they're on the same line, and that makes sense because they had the same learning curve and they were the same data, just grouped in a different fashion. So this is important because now we know if we have lot data, we can convert to log space in order to calculate that slope, or that curve, the learning curve slope, in order to figure out what the learning curve is without having to have that perfect pairing of the doubling of units. And again, this reiterates a lot of what I was just saying. We convert the data right to log space. It can be, again, it could still be dollars or hours, it doesn't matter. We also need to convert the unit number if we have the unit number. If we don't have the unit number, we need to assign some kind of unit number. We usually use a lot midpoint, right? So we've got so many units in the lot that we have data for. We want to figure out what's the algebraic midpoint of that lot. We don't use just the middle, the average or the middle point of the lot. We use an algebraic form of calculating that, since we're talking about we're comparing the cost, which is decreasing at a rate. So we want to get the algebraic midpoint as opposed to the just average. So once we do those conversions, though, we end up with, the same formula as we would in the perfect data set, except it's now in log space. So we've got the natural log of y equals the natural log of the theoretical first unit plus the variable b, again, which is the learning curve slope, times the natural log of x. So, and then we take the exponential, which is the inverse of a natural log. So to go into log space, you use the natural log. To get out of log space, you use the exponential function. And we'll walk through all this in Excel in a minute, so we can show you how to do those calculations in Excel. And this converts you back to real space. And that's where we get the y equals t1 times b raised to the times x raised to the b. So a little bit more information about that lot midpoint part of the calculations, or part of the equations, how to figure this out, right? So again, if we're using realistic data, which is, this is data that's readily available, and we'll go over some of the locations you can get this data as well. We also need to calculate the algebraic lot midpoint. So for the first lot of a production, we've got pretty simple calculation to do the midpoint. We just take the lot size and divide by 2 if the total lot size is less than 10. And if the lot size is equal to or greater than 10, we divide by 3. This has to do with the fact that at the early beginnings of a production lot, the price drops more rapidly because obviously you're doubling your quantities more early in the production. When you go from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, by the time you hit 4 units, you've already doubled twice. As opposed to later, when you're going from 10 to 20, you're only doubling once in that same span of units. So for those other spans of lots, we've got a more complicated formula here to do, where we take the first unit of that lot plus the last unit of that lot plus 2 times the square root of the product of the first times the last, and then we take all that and we divide by 4. That gives us the algebraic lot midpoint for that production lot. And then Y is the average unit cost, which is straightforward. The total cost of the lot divided by the total lot size, that's the average cost. So now with X and Y, we've created a pairing of the average cost of all the units in that lot and the midpoint for that lot. So the average cost is assigned to the midpoint. So if there was a unit produced in the middle, the algebraic middle, that unit would cost that average unit cost. So now that algebraic unit may not actually be a whole unit, it may be a partial unit, and that's why we use that calculation in order to do it, because again, because of the nature of the learning across the lot as it's being built, we're not going to deal with nice round numbers. A little bit more into the formulas again. So we now are introducing some cumulative average nuances. There's just slight nuances, obviously, because it's using the average units, average unit costs, and the cumulative number of units as opposed to the actual number of units in each lot. So where can you get the data? So a lot of the data that we can use in the cost community in defense acquisition is available through Defense Cost and Research Center, DCARC, which the website's there. You have to have a CAT card to get into there. You can also have integrated program management reports, which are deliverables for a lot of contracts where there's cost plus contracts or incentive type contracts. So again, and it's important to note that when you're looking at the data that you receive from these sources, the data does need to be normalized to a common year in order to make sure you're looking at the data properly. In order to effectively do your calculations, you need to remove inflation or external influences, escalation, and then look at it so that you're comparing apples to apples when you're doing the learning curve, so you're really getting a true picture of what specifically the learning is in the data. So now we're getting into the application. So again, we're gonna I pulled some data from DCARC. We're gonna kind of washed it a little bit. So we're just gonna use the avionics. It's an aircraft avionics modernization program. We've got 2 production lots of that program. For the purpose of this training, we're just gonna take the data that I'm giving you as it is. We're not gonna worry about normalizing it in any way. So it's already normalized. We're going to open up Excel and we're going to work through how to do some of these calculations in unit learning curve, and we'll also do the cum average, and we'll compare the two and compare them to the initial data so that we get an understanding of how to cross-check your data. So we're going to pause here. If you have the Excel file, now you want to open it up so that we can get into it, and then we'll start that very shortly. If you don't have the Excel file, it's a good time to pause the video and try to find it, or contact me in order to get it. So here we are in the Excel file. You'll see here, this is the unit learning curve calculation tab, and we're just going to walk through some of these calculations. If you want to pause the video here and work through this on your own first, feel free. If not, we can walk through it together. So again, here's the step 1 and 2 has already been done. I've already identified this is the element we're using. It's the airframe, and we're going to here's the data for lots 1 and 2. And now step 3, we need to calculate the lot midpoint. And again, I added the formulas over here and a little bit of information. So for this first lot, we're looking at a lot of 10 units. So if it's a lot of 10 units, then we're going to divide by the 3. So we take the lot size, divide by 3. So for the second lot, we get this more complicated formula here where we've got the first and last and the square root and so on. So let's see, we need to enter a formula here. We're going to do the first. So again, this is the second lot, and the first lot was 10 units. So the first unit in the second lot is going to be unit 11. And since the second lot is 10 units, again, if the first unit was unit 11, the last unit is going to be unit 20. So we've got 2 lots of 10. So at the end of 2 lots, we've got 20. So we're going to do plus 20. Plus 2 times the square root of 11 times 20. And all of that divided by 4. So again, we get the first plus the last plus 2 times the square root of the product of the first times the last, all divided by 4. Comes up with an answer here, 15.166 and change. Now's a good time to just kind of think about when you're going through these things, does this make sense, right? So we had units 11 through 20, and my calculation is saying that the midpoint is 15. Does that make sense? That's a good question to ask yourself as you're going through things like this, to make sure you're checking yourself with just some common sense. Okay, if we've got 10 units and it goes from 11 to 20, does 15 and change make sense as a midpoint? Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so we can move on. If you came up with 18 or 23 or 4, those wouldn't make sense, obviously. So we would want to double check we're doing the right calculations at that point. Next, we've got the average unit cost. Again, total lot cost divided by lot size. So we've got lot cost divided by lot size. And since we want to add this formula, the same equation down here, but we want to drag it down, we can just go right over here and drag this down. And that will, as you see here, it drags down these reference cells as well to target these cells so that it's all in line. This is obviously simple to check, right? Because we're dividing by 10. Makes sense. Okay. Next, we want to find the natural log of the lot midpoint and the average unit cost. Right, so we're in here, and as you see here, I even tell you, the equal sign, and then ln is the function in Excel. So if you type in ln and then hit tab, it'll give you the opportunity to put in your references. This one's a lot midpoint, so we can click here and hit enter. And again, we can drag this down. And then for the average unit cost, again, ln, tab, average unit cost, and dragged it down. Okay, so now we've got the natural log of the midpoint and the average unit cost. So let's see here. Step 6, we want to create a scatter plot with the natural log of the log midpoint as your x's and the natural log of the average unit cost as your y's. So if you highlight these columns here, and then you go to Insert tab up here, and come over here to Scatter Plots. See this little, all these little dots, scatter plots, right? And you can insert a scatter plot, right? And because of the order of the columns here, it's got them mixed up, right? It's got your variables going this way, and it should be going up and down. So if we click this button here, this says switch row and column. It'll fix that, and then it's going up and down here. So we've got the lot midpoint on the x-axis here, and we've got the average unit cost here. So step 7. So we want to click on this area, make sure we're clicked on the chart here, right? We go over one of the dots here, and you right click it, right? And then you see the options here that pop up. So obviously you can do this other ways, but this is just the easiest way I like to do it. So we'll do it this way. And we want to add a trend line. When you click add a trend line, it's going to automatically pull up this format trend line sidebar. So we want to and if you click off of it and you need to get back to the format trend line, if you double click on the trend line, it will pull this right back up. So at the bottom, we're going to say display equation, right? So this is giving us the equation that is this line. And this is important because this tells us what the slope and the intercept of that line are. So this is the slope of that line, and then this is the intercept. That's where, if that line continued, where it would cross the axis here. So again, the trend line shows up in this format, right? We've got bx, so the b is the negative 0.0195, and then x is x, obviously, and then the a is the intercept. Again, this is in log space, right? Because our variables that we're plotting are in log space. So the a is going to be 7.2998. B is negative 5. Okay. So we did the scatter plot, and we let Excel tell us what the formula was for the line, so that we don't have to try to calculate that ourselves. So now here we are. We put them into this little table here for step 8, and then step 9. We're going to convert these. This is A prime and B prime. Again, the prime, or the little hash there, or tick mark there, is to make sure we remember that these numbers are in log space. They're not in real space. So now we need to convert them into real space. So in order to do that, and we can just close this here. In order to do that, we set this, we do equals exp, which is the exponential function, right? Tab, we want to raise this. Okay. And then b, because of the nature of b, so it's actually bx, right? When you raise a variable like that to the exponent, right? The x will go away. The x will be raised to 1 less power, so the x will go away and become a 1, and then the b will become the exponent. So when we do that conversion, it actually doesn't change b at all. It just repositions it, again, because the new equation is in this format, where we've got x being raised to the b power, as opposed to b times x. So our new equation is going to be 1480.0039, again, a times x, this makes you feel better, raised to that power. So since we're in this format now, we've got our real space calculation, or real space formula for the curve. So now we can calculate the actual learning curve. So we've got the b variable, but now we can convert that to the actual slope by raising 2 to its power. And there we get the learning curve slope. So based on the calculations we made, the learning curve slope is 98.66%. So and we'll go over how to check that when we get back to the briefing. But it's not over 100, right? So it's not really low. It's just under 100. So it's doesn't seem unreasonable from the start. So now in step 12, we're going to calculate the unit costs of all of our units that we produced based on the learning curve that we calculated. So again, we can just take the formula, the equation here that we have is ax raised to the b, and we can use that and say, okay, well, x is the number, this is the unit that we've produced. So when we do a, or the intercept, times, in this case, x is the unit number, so we can just select this here. This is the unit number, x, and we're going to raise that to the b. So we've got a times x raised to the b. So that's our curve calculation, and we can hit enter. And I do have a tip here. Alternatively, instead of typing in the numbers, we could use cell references, right? So we do have those cells here, right? So we've got A, right, is already linked here. We don't need to type it in, which is important to do in Excel in order to ensure that you maintain accuracy, because when you fat finger in numbers, you're adding in the possibility of typing them incorrectly, or you may be rounding, whereas Excel's not rounding. This may only go to 4 decimals here, but it could actually be much longer, and Excel's just rounding it to 4. So when you use the cell references, you get much more precision to the calculations within Excel. And then again, we multiply by x, which is 1 here, and then we raise to the b. So because we're using cell references and we're going to we're going to drag this formula down to save ourselves some time. We want to lock two of these references. So as we drag this formula, we want X to drag with it, right? Because we want to change the unit number, but we don't want to change the A or the B because those are constants. So if we put dollar signs in front of the alpha and the numerical inputs here, it will lock those positions. So if you hit F4, it automatically puts dollar signs in front of both the alpha and the numeric. If you hit F4 again, it just does the numeric. Again, it does just the alpha. Again, it clears them, cycles right through, does both of them. So we want both of them. And then we jump over here to the B variable, and we want both of them on there as well. And we hit enter. So now you see here the formula, same formula we have here. And we could drag this down all the way to the 20. And we see here it's steadily decreasing unit price as we go through the lot, which is what's expected when you're doing, again, repetitive manual tasks. And then for the total, we just want to sum all these up, right? Because these are all the costs of the individual units. So if we equal sum tab, and we can just highlight all these and hit enter, and we get the total cost of all these units. And that's it for your unit learning curve. We've walked through, how to use the data, how to convert the data, how to plot the data to get the line, how to convert that line back into real space, and then how to use that line in order to estimate what the cost of all the units is going to be. So now we can go ahead and jump over to the QM average learning curve and do it there. If you want to go pause the video and do the QM average on your own and then watch the video in order to check your work, now is a good time to do that pause and try that out. Okay, so here we are over in the QM average tab. Again, same data. We're doing the same thing. At the beginning, first two steps are done for you. And now step 3. We want to calculate the cumulative quantity. Again, we're using cumulative average, so we need to do cumulatives as opposed to individual lot calculations. So what after the first lot, which is 10 units, how many units do we have? It's not a trick question. 10 units. After the second lot, we had the first lot, which was 10 units, plus the second lot, which was also 10 units. How many units do we have when we're done? 20 units. Again, what's the cumulative cost after we've produced the 10 units? It's the cost of all 10 units, which is the lot cost. And the cumulative cost for the 2 lots, again, the first lot plus the second lot. It would obviously be a little trickier if you had like the first and the third lot and you didn't have the second lot. You would need to find out how many units were in that third lot and what the cost was of that third lot in order to do these calculations. But when you're dealing with the first and second, it's very straightforward. Here we go. Step 4. We want the cumulative average cost. So we've got the cumulative quantity and the cumulative cost. So the cumulative average is the cumulative cost divided by the cumulative quantity. And again, the cumulative cost divided by the cumulative quantity. And again, we can check our work here. And okay, we would expect the average cost to go down as we add additional lots. And it does go down slightly, so we feel pretty good about that. Haven't done anything wrong yet. Now we need to find the natural log of the cumulative average cost and the cumulative quantity. So again, using the ln formula, cumulative quantity, just make sure you click in the right cell, cumulative quantity, and cumulative average cost, CAC. And we drag those down. You can drag multiple formulas down together. Okay, so we've got those. So now we want to create a scatter plot for those two data points. So again, we're going to go to Insert up here. We want to just highlight these cells here. See, highlight those, and we go to Scatter Plot. Click that. Here we go. We got the scatter plot. So once again, we've got the situation where it's pairing them this way. We want to pair them the other way. Switch row and column. Here we go. We've got our updated line. So we want updated dots. They're in position, right? That's the X. This is the Y. That makes sense. And now we want to add our trend line. Right click. Add trend line. And then we want to scroll down here and let's go ahead and display the equation on the chart. Here we go. And we've got our equation again. Close this. Step 8, take the equation and put it in here, right? Again, just like before, the A prime and B prime. And again, this is where, we are fat fingering here because we're moving things from a chart into a table. So we're only going to be as good as the rounding that's provided here. Okay, and you'll notice if you remembered back in a few minutes ago when we did the unit, these are different values, right? So using the data, same exact data, just handling it a little differently, we're getting different values, we get a different curve, the graph looks different, there's a lot of differences here. We'll see how much those differences translate to actual calculation differences when we're done, but it's just an observation. And again, step 9, we're going to take the exponents, and just like before, B prime to B conversion, it doesn't change B. Okay, in step 10, we're going to write the equation in the new format. So A times X raised to the B okay. And obviously we've got different inputs here, so we're going to see what the learning curve is. 2 raised to the B (98.54), slightly different than what we had with the unit theory, but again, still very close and still under 100 and not really low, so it makes sense. It's not an issue where we're going to say, oh, we did something wrong. And again, it's important to cross-check yourself, sanity check yourself as you go through these things so that you know when to stop and to double check your work or triple check your work or correct it if it's clearly wrong. So again, we're going to do A times X, which is the unit number, and we're going to raise that to the B, and we're going to lock these two cell references, A and the B, and we will let X drag down, okay? And there we go. And again, it's steadily decreasing values as we go from the first unit to the 20th unit. Makes sense. So now it's important to remember we're doing cumulative average learning curve theory. So what is the total here under cumulative average theory? So it's not the sum of all the units, because those unit costs are the average unit costs at that lot or that quantity. So in order to get the total cost for all 20, we actually want to use the product of the average cost at 20 times 20. So since that's the average cost when we produce 20, you multiply it by 20, it gives you the total cost for 20 units. And there you have it. We've now walked through the cum average learning curve calculations. And now let's compare the two. We jump over here to the comparison chart. It's set up to automatically link to the other two charts, as you see here. In order to produce these, you see we've got two different curves. They're pretty much the same curve, very similar curves, obviously, but that's to be expected since our learning curve percentage was very close, so that the actual curve is very similar. But they start at different points, so they end at different points. But again, they're providing us different information, so that's to be expected. You see here are the two slopes, again, very close to each other. And we've got the total costs for all the units here. And you see here we actually put in the actual production costs, right? So this was the actual totals of the two lots. And this is how wrong our estimates. So these calculations were basically estimates of those lots using the data that we had. And you can see here how far off we are using the two methods from the actual costs. So very close, very, very close. So now we've cross-checked our calculations or our estimate against the actual data that we used in order to create the curve. So we're confident that the actual learning curve slopes we've calculated here are correct. So we can now go and use them if we're doing, we're going to estimate what is it going to cost for lot 3. We can now use the learning curve from lot 1 and 2 to calculate lot 3 or 4 or so on. If we've got an analogous system, so this was a avionics modification to an aircraft. So if we've got a new program that's doing an avionics modification to an aircraft, we can use this learning curve, or we could expect this learning curve for the airframe portion of the modification to that aircraft. Okay, and now let's jump back to the briefing. So again, there's some general guidelines for the application of learning curves. So we've gone through an exercise. Here are some typical learning curve amounts, right? When you see industries, if you're dealing with electrical type of labor, we would usually expect to see 75 to 85% as your learning curve. If you're dealing with electronics, like assembling electronics, you would only expect 90 to 95%. Again, machining, 90 to 95. Welding, we would see a little bit better with 88 to 82% learning on those types of activities. The reason why we see these differences as the typical industry slopes is, again, because of the level of automation. When you're doing machining, you're typically using a machine to do a lot of the work. It's just a matter of you learning, the intricacies of the low-level details of setting up the machine to do the work and positioning the parts and so on. And same thing with electronics. A lot of the assembly is done by a machine in order to ensure precision. So that's a very automated process. And again, we've got a table here that shows, if you've got a very manual process, you're going to have a much higher learning curve slope. And if you have a very automated process, you're going to have a very less of a slope. It's going to be a higher percentage. It's important to note this is also where companies invest their money in order to automate things. It's going to impact the learning curve slope. So if you know a company that you're working with is preparing to make a big investment in automation of a certain production line, you may want to address that in your learning curve assumptions or learning curve calculations in order to account for the impact that will have to learning. The example that was always provided to me about the importance of automation and learning curve was regarding the Joint Strike Fighter F-35. When the original estimates for the vertical lift variant of the Joint Strike Fighter was done, the vertical lift fan, the fan that goes in the middle of the aircraft, in order to give it vertical lift, was assumed to have a substantial learning curve, because as you're making those fans over and over again, you're going to learn quite a bit. That turned out to be a very bad assumption because the fan was actually manufactured 100% automated. It was just a block of aluminum put into a machine, and the machine carved the fan out of the block of aluminum, and they took it out and did a spot inspection of the work the machine did, and that was it. So there was virtually no learning. So that learning curve assumption contributed largely to a Nunn-McCurdy breach of the program at some point, and that was a problem for the program. So making good assumptions and understanding your manufacturing base and understanding the processes they use is important for the application of learning curves. It's really the takeaway there. And that brings me to the actual takeaway slide. We use unit learning curve for estimating because it provides that level of accuracy regarding the actual cost of the actual units, so we can actually phase those units. We're not buying all the units in 1 year. If we were, then cumulative average is just as good as unit learning curve as far as total budget, but it's not going to support contract negotiations because you don't know what the individual prices are. It's not going to help us evaluate a B table in a contract because B tables are based on unit prices typically. You could have a B table that was based on quantity buy discounts or something where it shows, if you buy more than 2,000 units, you get this price per unit. That is where you would actually need to use the cumulative average learning curve in order to get a good feel of is it a fair price. So there's obviously different applications for the different ones, but as far as when we're actually producing an estimate for a budget, we want to use unit learning curve, again, because we care about that specific unit cost. That ties right into full funding policy and the law about fully funding end items. We want to know what that end item costs, so we use unit learning curve to do that. So again, we can use this data to calculate for analogous systems for the learning curve, not necessarily the T1 cost. So we could have a manpower buildup of what it takes to do the avionics modification. We could say, okay, well, we know it's going to take 10,000 hours the very first time they do this modification to the avionics system, and then we can use, okay, well, that if that's the theoretical first time, then we're going to apply the learning curve we just calculated to that. So that's our new A in our calculation. So we can do things like that as well. And that does it for the learning curve on the job training class. Thank you for listening, and have a nice day.